Welcome to another episode of the Architecture of Health. I'm Deb Voisin, and this week I have David Crow as my guest. He's been a natural medicine practitioner for 40 years and helps empower people so that they can become experts in their own self-care. A DIY master teacher that's perfectly in the realm of what we're here at Architecture of Health to do, which is give people agency and tools. Welcome to our show, David.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you for inviting me.
David and I were introduced by a wonderful person named Scott Mason, and when I looked at his bio, I felt very lucky that we have someone with such a well-rounded point of view about building health. And when David and I were talking about what to discuss, he came up with this idea of a clinical level of self-care. And the reason that attracted me is when people start taking more and more interest in their self-care, there's this gap between what kind of standards of care there would be in different practitioners, and how can I tell, have I gone rogue? Am I just, improvising everything here, or are there methods, systems, standards that can help me make sure that I'm investing my effort wisely, that adds even more safety to the idea of self-care. So both agency and security, and which are actually the same thing. So David, what even made you want to propose this conversation topic?
Well, because this is what I do. This is my clinical work now after many decades of practicing Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine hands-on in a clinical practice. I am now doing telemedicine consultations, and I am focusing on the contemporary concerns that everybody has. And contemporary concerns are increasingly complicated and require an increasingly higher level of education to understand what to do. Now, this is coming from several major areas. One is that our conventional allopathic medical system is getting harder and harder for people to navigate. And I think we could say that in a lot of places in the country, it's really breaking down. It's very hard to get high quality allopathic medical care. And what allopathic medicine offers, a lot of times people don't want it or they can't tolerate it because it's pharmaceutical based. And the side effects of medications are causing so many problems, and people are becoming more aware of the problems of pharmaceuticals and are wanting alternatives. So that's the condition of the allopathic system. And on the other hand, the alternative to that isn't much better either, which is basically internet medicine, which is driven primarily by marketing claims, and that's a bad mix. And in that, there is this abundance of very confusing information that people get lost in, that's all mixed up with marketing. And there's a very heavy emphasis on consuming products that are not necessarily relevant to the individual. And natural products can cause all kinds of side effects as well. And this is, all woven together with this kind of overemphasis, actual obsession about detoxification. And so what we have then is we have two really dissatisfactory medical systems to choose from. One is based on pharmaceutical drugs, and the other is based on all these natural products. And it's really confusing for people to figure out what to do and how to navigate through all of this. So that's where I began to move out of doing more conventional clinical practice using combined modalities of Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine, practicing acupuncture and Ayurvedic panchakarma practices, and detoxification, and herbal medicine primarily, but started to really see that we need to use the best of everything. We need to use the best of allopathic medicine. And how do we determine what that is? And how do we talk to our doctors about getting that? And how do we say no to statins and things like that? And at the same time, how do we sort out this big mess of pills that a naturopath has told us to take on an empty stomach every morning that's hurting our digestive system? So what the concept is, clinical level self-care, is that basically at this point, every person needs to know more about it, how to take care of their health at a medical level. Now, I make a distinction between this term clinical level self-care and what most people would think of as self-care. Most people, if you just say self-care, well, we think about, all right, a healthy diet, but even that's confusing. What is a healthy diet? And so that's where we actually have to understand more about our own digestive system and what our body type is, and our digestive system is maybe changed since we took that course of antibiotics. I mean, we have to approach even the basics of self-care on a more individualized level. So there are some forms of exercise that people are doing that are harming themselves, and there's lots and lots of herbs that people are taking that are not doing what they're supposed to do or causing adverse reactions, and then all these supplements and nutraceuticals and all of these things that people think are good. Well, they are as long as they're working, but these things also are not really very individualized. And at the same time, a lot of people are on medications and they want to get off, or they're being threatened with medications. And if you don't get your blood pressure down, then you're going to have to do this. So more and more, we need education. And that's what clinical level self-care is all about. We need to become educated patients. We need to become educated practitioners of the right kind of self-care methods. So that's where I rely on my background, which includes the constitutional analysis from systems like Ayurveda, and it includes a lot of herbal training with formulas and ways that we think in terms of giving the right kind of herbs for the right kind of problems to the right individual for the right length of time. And so natural medicine becomes very individualized if we take the time to actually understand exactly what is going on in our own body at this particular time. So I have key principles of self-care that I follow, and it constitutes a kind of system that is very easy for people to learn and to follow. So that is the overview of what I mean by that particular term.
Wow, that is beautiful. I'm just sitting over here writing so many highlights down. Yes, marketing. I heard the amount of money that natural medicine, like the supplement industry, has been pulling in. It was shocking to me to think that in the old days I could be, oh, that's pharma pushed, but now there's also so much marketing around anything else that's healthy that, again, and honestly, I'll say the same thing. Even certain fitness things are highly marketed. Almost everything that we end up getting in our hands is highly marketed. And the confusion that comes when there's just, the internet is so full of information. If you don't have some sort of principles or system or filters or standards, it can get really overwhelming to even start. I want to dive in a little bit more. I love your idea of getting the best of everything. Yeah, how do we even know what the best part of allopathic medicine is? And I don't know if I've told the listeners, you listeners, this before, but I personally haven't been in an allopathic medical office for 10 years. I have some very smart friends, various kind of practitioners of other things, and I go deep. With my son's recovery from all sorts of strange things, I learned, oh, how does the lymphatic system work? How does the, is the heartbeat, is it supposed to be this level or this level? Are these fats good or those fats good? And I got very, very deep in kind of almost like an architectural engineer, understanding the inputs and outputs of the body as a system. That gave me more confidence than the average bear, but it took a huge amount of education. And I'm still probably missing out on a whole bunch of other things that you said that there is the best part of allopathic medicine. We want to harvest the best parts of everything, but education is definitely key. I want to dive in a little bit more to when you said this obsession with detox. I remember many years ago, I remember hearing my natural friends, they'd go, "Oh, that's toxic. I want to detox." And I was very skeptical. I was like, I'm tough. I don't care. I'm just going to, I don't want to stress about everything. But then honestly, that was understanding the nourishment detoxification cycles and restoring the system's ability to discern poison from nourishment was a big breakthrough for me. What do you mean when you talk about this obsession with detox?
Well, that's a big subject. Let's back up and let me answer one of the first questions that you raised there, which is, um, what is there from allopathic medicine that we can use easily as clinical level self-care practitioners? One of the easiest things is that we can get our own blood tests. And we don't have to go to a doctor to get it. You can just order it online. And there's a number of companies that do that, Quest and Life Extension. You can just call them up, order your own blood work. And this is just an aspect of, biochemical medicine that's really good to track. And if we have had an encounter with a doctor and they have said, your cholesterol is too high, you need to go on statins, then you may want to start monitoring your cholesterol yourself and see, what it responds to positively or negatively. And so this is one aspect of allopathic medicine that's really easy. But the other thing that allopathic medicine is definitely outstanding in are things that require surgery. Okay. And that's also part of clinical level self-care, because if you have something that requires surgery, then first of all, you got to have a good relationship with a surgeon, and you got to know what they're going to do and why, and what are the alternatives, and what are the innovations. That's another thing, is that so many innovations are coming in Western medicine now that are making procedures that were once barbaric relatively benign. And so, it could be really important to have a procedure done, but you want to be educated about it and find the best ways to do it. But then that's where we start to integrate natural medicine and allopathic medicine together, because there may not be a need for a surgery if you have alternatives, natural alternatives for certain conditions. Okay. But there's also many natural alternatives for a lot of things that Western doctors want, a lot of the drugs they want to put you on. But how do you know whether you should be on a medication or not? Okay, and here's where we have two uh, basic forms of thinking on this, and they're both wrong, which is fairly common, which is that we see the camp that says, everybody should be on these drugs. And that's wrong, because if you take a specific drug, then the doctors are going to say, well, everybody should be on statins if their LDL, goes over a certain level. And that's just wrong, okay? Because you got to take into consideration so many other kinds of individualized factors. But on the other hand, the erroneous thinking is on the natural side, and people say, I don't want to take any drugs at all, and it could be that a medication could save your life. And so therefore, we have to use the best of both systems. And in order to decide whether a medication is medically necessary, we got to be pretty educated about it. And that includes having a partnership with the doctor, which is part of being a clinical level practitioner, is how to talk to doctors about these things. But on the other hand, we also don't want to just reject things because they're allopathic either. And so those are the two fundamental errors of thinking that people have about these medical systems. And so what I try to do is bring them together and say, let's just think this through and look at all of the questions and come to some clarity about what we need and don't need. All right. And that's not something that you get in a 5-minute discussion with a doctor who's under pressure. And it's not something you're going to find on the internet either. So what's missing is critical thinking and analysis about what to do and why and what sequence and what's really necessary. And nobody's got time for that. So that's clinical level self-care is critical thinking and asking the right questions. Now we apply that when it comes to this, what I called obsession about detox. And I think it's a pretty accurate term, actually, because when it comes to natural treatment, everything seems to have gotten thrown into a few wastebasket diagnoses from the naturopathic medical community and the functional medicine community and the internet medicine community. And those wastebasket diagnoses are all the same. They're, oh, you have parasites, or, you have SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth. Oh, you have heavy metals. Okay. Well, those are real medical issues, but they're not treated with internet medicine. If you have heavy metals, if you have a medical toxicity, medical case of heavy metal poisoning, that's totally different. It's not a wastebasket diagnosis. That's a real medical condition. And then on the other hand, if you have parasites, that's a real medical condition. Okay, but what's happening now is that all of these trendy wastebasket diagnoses are coming out and they're being given to everybody to treat everything. And so every chronic or acute condition is now being blamed on parasites, heavy metals, and SIBO. Okay, and it's just not accurate and it doesn't work. And it's ruining a lot of people's digestive systems because the concept of toxicity uh, is a real simple idea for marketing, but the reality of toxicity is really complicated physiologically. And so if you want to detoxify, you've got to understand how the body works. So we could take a simple example. Lots of people now are really worried about microplastic toxicity. There's evidence coming out that microplastics are in the food chain. They're passing through our gut all the time. They're accumulating in our brain. And as soon as you say that, as soon as you start teaching about this, and you've right away got to teach people about detox psychology, because when people hear about toxins, immediately they have fear and they want to get the stuff out of the body. And they think that more is better. And they think that you do it once and then you're clean. Okay. And that's not how detoxification works. Detoxification is 50% of what the body is doing all the time since we were born. And the other 50% is extracting nutrients. And there's cases that are clearly needing detoxification, but you've got to know the constitution, the strength, and you've got to know the climate, and you've got to know where the toxin is and what it is and what system is it in and how you're going to get it out the best. And this gets overly simplified into all of these things like these purges and coffee enemas and these laxatives and this flush and that flush and gallbladder stuff, all this kind of stuff. And what ends up happening is that they end up coming to see me after they've hurt themselves. Detoxification is excessive detoxification and harm from detoxification is 50% of why people consult with me. Now, there's a real simple principle that we can follow here that I like to quote this priestess, a Taoist priestess in China from 900 AD, and she wrote a manuscript on how to achieve longevity. And she summed up a real basic principle of Chinese medicine, which is nourish the weak, cleanse the strong. Now, what does this have to do with detox? Well, when you do a detox, you feel better. All right. Why? Well, because you flushed some stuff out of your gut. Maybe because you ate less. Okay. Maybe because you got more hydration. All right. And so you felt better. And people always say, well, I always feel better when I do a detox. All right. That's great. Then what happens? Well, then your bowels don't ever quite come back to normal. And then you kind of go back to your old habits. And then the symptoms come back again. And so then you want to do another flush. And then 3 months later, you want to do another flush. And this goes on and on until 5 or 10 years later, you can't digest anything without having to take regular coffee enemas. Okay. And so it builds up laxative dependency. It ruins the gut microbiome. It damages the permeability of the gut, which leads to, paradoxically, more assimilation of toxins. So excessive detoxification makes us more vulnerable to the toxins in the environment. And therefore, we have to balance detoxification with rejuvenation. And this becomes especially important as we get older. So, if people have been doing a lot of detox for a long time, then it starts to show up and they start to lose weight, they start to lose muscle mass, they start to have chronic digestive problems. And the more severe or cathartic or harsh the detox is, the more likelihood that something's really going to get hurt. And so I've seen people who have lost their gallbladders to this so-called gallbladder flush. Okay. It's a harsh cathartic type of process. So how do we detoxify correctly? Well, that's a huge subject. Who's got time to study that? Okay, when all you need to do is go on the internet and buy these products. But as I said, this is a huge percentage of the cases that I work with. And many people report that when they start to do these detoxes, they feel worse right away. And there's a real obvious reason for that in most cases. And that is, you shouldn't be trying to do all this harsh detox when you're 60 years old. You need more nourishment. Okay. You can't be doing more of this, laxative therapy. If you've been doing it for 10 years, you need to deal with laxative dependency now. So there's a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of confusion. But the reason that there is so much interest in this is because there is so much toxin. Now, the detox psychology is really important. And one of the things that is a fundamental principle about detoxification is that if you think about a toxin and you say, well, okay, parasites, you better know parasitology. That's a branch of medicine, not pseudoparasitology that just says everybody's got parasites. Parasites are microbes. You got to know the identification. You have to identify the species. You got to know the life cycle. You have to know the symptoms. Okay, it's a branch of medicine. Study it. Learn about how to deal with parasites. Don't just do a parasite cleanse. Okay, there's no such thing. It's not parasitology. So heavy metals, yeah, they cause problems, but you need to understand the difference between the heavy metals that are in the environment, those that are coming in the body, those that are causing problems, and metal toxicity. So we have to identify that, yeah, all of these toxins, they have medical consequences, but can we get rid of all this stuff all the time? Now let's just go back to that idea of microplastics. Now, there's a simple principle of detoxification, which is that if something is in motion, you can help it out. You can help it get out. That means if the microplastic particles are in the gut, then what you do first is you prevent them from getting into your liver. Then that takes you to restoration of the gut membrane. And that takes you to nourishment as opposed to detox, because the more you detox, the more you damage the gut membrane and the more plastic gets into your liver. Okay, so we can help the plastic out by building our immunity of the gut. And therefore, what we see is that a lot of detoxification is not about getting toxins out. It's about building our strength to resist the toxins. Okay. And the other basic principle here is that if you look at all of the different toxins from the environment that we're afraid of, that are passing through us to some degree, they all create one universal response inside the body, and that is inflammation. Now, in some cases, we cannot get the toxins out of the tissues. And this is something that you have to consider when somebody tells you, there's all kinds of products now coming for detox the microplastics. All right, well, if they're in your gut, you can get them out. It's going to be harder to get them out of your liver. And what about your brain? You can't get them out of your brain. Okay. But that doesn't mean you can't detoxify the effect of the microplastic in the brain. And that is the inflammatory process that the plastic creates, or the metal creates, or the microbes create. And therefore, detoxification is much, much deeper than just this idea of we get something out. Detoxification is also we turn down the immune system's overreaction to it, turn off the inflammation, and live in peaceful coexistence with the toxins that are inside of us that are also increasing continuously because we're getting older. And those toxins are also things that people don't even think about. If we want to talk about detox, let's talk about cholesterol. Okay. If we want to talk about detox, let's talk about your A1C, your pre-diabetic levels of sugar. Sugar is a poison. Okay. Cholesterol is a poison. Inflammation is a poison. And these three things are much more important to address because those three things are also the vectors for the other toxins in the environment to really do damage. And so the real problem is not the microplastics. Okay. The real problem is that the microplastics get all bound up with the cholesterol. Okay. And so therefore, if we want to talk about detox, we have to talk about not only the external things, we got to talk about the 50% of detoxification that the body's always doing. And what is it trying to detoxify? Metabolic waste. And if those metabolic wastes are not being detoxified effectively, then we become toxic, even if we live in a clean environment and eat a clean diet. That's a quick overview of some of the real simple principles that are just being completely overlooked with all of this.
That's incredible. I took so many notes. The psychology of detox is a war mindset. I remember getting all into the parasite craze, itching, like I gotta get them out, and then learning that some perfectly healthy people could have 200 varieties just coexisting within their microbiome. It's a garden that we have, and we
Well,
don't need to pull.
let's make a distinction between parasites and microbiome. Okay, that's a source of confusion. Now, parasites are real things. Okay, but we don't really have epidemics of parasites in North America. There are epidemics of parasites in India, Southeast Asia, Africa, places where hygiene is really poor. That's where people have real parasitic problems. Now, one of the ways that you can identify, self-diagnose, is if you had really good digestive health, you felt fine, you had no major health problems, and then you went to one of those places and you got a febrile diarrhea disease or illness while you were there. You had, massive diarrhea with a fever. Okay. And then when you came back, your digestion was never the same. Now that's a pretty there's a high likelihood that in that situation, you picked up something in your intestines. And that's where you got to say, what is it? Then you get into medical parasitology and you got to do the tests, and there are stool samples and there are blood tests and there are indicators where you can pretty clearly narrow it down. This is the organism. And you got to know the difference between Giardia and amoebas before you start treating them. Because in the one case, Giardia, there's a pretty high likelihood that with targeted high-level herbal medicine, you could knock it out. But with amoebas, you got to be really careful because they can get into your liver and eat you alive. Okay, so you need to know medical parasitology, but most people don't. And most people don't have a clear infection like that. Most people have chronic digestive problems. And then they go get a stool sample and they look at the microbiome and they see all these red flags and they think, oh my God, I've got all these things that I have to treat. And then they start attacking all of these things. And the more attacking they do, the more grapefruit seed extract that they take and things like that, the worse their digestive system becomes. And so, in a case like that, the alternative, the naturopathic testing for parasites and microbiome overgrowth of microbes frequently just leads to more detox that weakens the gut immunity even further. So, this is an area that requires critical thinking, and it requires education, and it requires making a pretty clear decision about, do you really have something you have to attack here? Or is this really something that you need to build up your microbiome with healthy diet and probiotics and fermented foods and certain kinds of herbs that help to regulate the bowel movements and reduce the inflammation? So, we have to be very careful whenever there is this idea of parasites that we don't automatically think we're going to attack it. Okay, that's the main point that I'm responding to in your comment. We got to be very careful with these ideas because they take us down all the wrong treatment avenues.
Yeah, the main one with us was blastocystis hominis, and we did the functional medicine test, but then the natural antibiotics, you're like the garden still gets trampled when you go after it, even with we used biocidin or something.
Blastocystis does not require harsh treatment. It does not require antibiotics. It does not require nystatin. It does not require grapefruit seed extract. Okay. Blastocystis is a pathogenic bacteria, along with dozens of other pathogenic bacteria, that are only a concern in immune compromised patients, where the infection is getting out of control and the symptoms are clearly related to the microbe. But that's what I mean wastebasket diagnosis, because they're finding, oh, you got blastocystis. Well, that must be responsible for this, 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 and this, and this. And it isn't. Okay, they try to link together all these things with one organism. And so if we look at that, what that tells us is that naturopathic and functional medicine thinking is really just like allopathic thinking. It's germ theory, except that they're using natural products to treat it. But we want to get out of germ theory unless the germ is really significant.
Yeah, this was after explosive diarrhea on a third world trip. So
Okay, now that's different. That's different.
yeah, yeah, and so the interesting thing that I was aligning with you around is the thinking, the mindset that the psychology, the parasite psychology that started to set in was that war mindset rather than the gardening mindset. And what you're saying is, when it's a war, you do need to know what war you're fighting and not just start to see everyone as an enemy you spray with glyphosate, right? Exactly. So, or yeah, what was it? Whatever Monsanto's greatest chemical war weapon is.
That's it. That's it. Now, if that was an infection that you picked up while traveling, there's a very high likelihood that it would have resolved itself. And a lot of bacterial infections are self-resolving, self-clearing. But there are also really good treatments that can be done at that particular time. And you do need to find out what's going on. And if they found blastocystis, then okay, it's pretty high likelihood that that was associated. But not necessarily. You could have had blastocystis before you went, and you got food poisoning on top of it.
And it could be that the parasites in West Africa aren't even in the list of parasites that are being studied. Like, I don't really even know. And the one other point of alignment is, once I finally learned the role of protecting our microbiome, there was some kind of study, and I wish I had the reference, where they took two groups of cattle and they laced one group of cattle's food they had been given antibiotics at some point, and the other group of cattle hadn't. Then they put lead in the feed of each set of cattle to see how much poison would cross the gut lining, and the ones that had ever been exposed to antibiotics, the poison was found throughout all of their tissues in their body. So to your point, anything that lowers our guard, lowers the health of our gut lining and increases permeability, even normal threats, even normal thing can start looking threatening when you're not nourished and you start killing off all the good guys in your gut lining. Yeah.
Well, that's why I said that detoxification is not so much about getting things out because there's no end to that. And it's futile. Okay, we can get some things out, and it's even better if we can prevent them getting in the first place. Okay, but we can't prevent everything from getting in. We can't get everything out, and that's just life. Okay, and it's always been like that. And then the question is, well, what is the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is good health and longevity. And the main thing that I am seeing is that people are damaging their health trying to get poisons out, okay? When they actually need to be focusing on becoming stronger immunologically to keep them from penetrating the mucous membranes of both the lungs and the sinuses and the gut. And so therefore, what we are really going for is we need to be really strong to live in a toxic world, not to try to be really clean, but to be really strong. So that's the main difference.
I love it. Really strong to live in a toxic world.
Yeah,
And to
that's it. That's
reiterate,
that's it.
from that 900 AD Taoist priestess, you said, nourish the weak, cleanse the strong. I need to align with you around one other point. This is many years ago. I tried some lemonade cleanse thing, and my body just kept getting more and more bloated because I was so undernourished. It was awful. I finally went to an acupuncturist on the last day, and I got thermography even. They were like, "What happened to you? You might need to go to the hospital." Like, what happened? I was like, oh, I was trying to be healthy. It was such a harsh, horrible side effect of cleansing way too hard. I will never do anything like that again. I want to make myself strong, and harsh is one word I heard you use several times. As people try these harsh things, then they do it more, and then they do it more, and then they're weak.
Well, don't take it personally because humans have been hurting themselves with incorrect treatments forever. Okay. So lots and lots of people have, you know, damaged their health and even died from improper treatments and natural things too, going back a long time. So it's a source of confusion, and that's why we need education. And the education comes down to learning how to do critical thinking and asking the right questions and understanding the processes. And this is what takes the most time, really, is um, how many people actually know what the gut-liver axis is and how it works? There's hardly anybody, you know, or how many people know about the gut-brain axis? Well, more people are hearing about this, but not many people actually understand the mechanics of it. Now, it's not hard to learn, okay? And it's pretty easy to learn how to feel those systems and monitor those systems in ourselves. And that's another really important principle of clinical level self-care is we need to develop a higher level of body awareness so that we are really learning how to listen to the sensations that the body is giving us. And this is something I'm always surprised by when, people give me their health history and they tell me, well, they tell me about, I'm seeing a naturopath, and I say, well, what are they giving you? And they give me this list of 30 different products, and they're taking them all at once on an empty stomach, and they're not connecting that that's what's causing their stomach ache. Okay. I always point out, well, let's become more aware of the body. Now, this is another very important aspect of clinical level self-care that I want to mention here. And that is, if anybody is on a medication, they need to study it. Now, unfortunately, doctors do not educate their patients about what this drug is going to do or the potential side effects. Here, take this. That's for your blood pressure. Goodbye. Okay. And then the patient doesn't do the research either. And so then they come to me and I say, well, how long have you been on this medication? They say, well, 6 months. And I say, all right, and now you are reporting to me that you have these new symptoms over the last 6 months. Let's do a little research. Let's go to drugs.com and let's put in your medication. And oh, guess what? Here they are. So I do an exercise with patients right away that the doctor should have done with them at the beginning, and then they should have done it if the doctor didn't. And I end up doing it. And we just go through and we look at three things. We look at new symptoms that have appeared since you went on the medication. We look at old symptoms that got worse. And then we look at what systems are being affected by the medication. We always see the same systems. The brain is being affected, the kidneys are being affected, liver is being affected, guts being affected. These drugs, virtually every prescription drug affects every organ, potentially adversely. All right. So that's an exercise that everybody should do. And I will clarify here, I am not for or against anything in medicine. I am not pro-vaccine. I am not anti-vaccine. Because if you take a position, that is not critical thinking. If you use critical thinking, that means you do not take a position. Okay. And the same with pharmaceuticals, and the same with procedures, and the same with herbs and natural products. I do not take a position on anything because that's not scientific and it's not medical. Okay. Because these subjects are too complicated, we can't just lump them into these, simplified, polarized arguments. Everybody has to be looked at case by case as an individual. And nobody's got time for that. And that's the problem. The doctor can't do that. And a lot of times the patient can't do it either. And so that's what I do. I take the time and I look at the individual case. And then we do the critical thinking and we research the drugs and we find out if there's been a chronological link. And this is another exercise that I advise everybody to do. Write out your whole health history chronologically and then connect the dots. Okay, did you have mono when you were a teenager? Oh, you had Epstein-Barr. Well, does that have any relationship to how seriously you got COVID or how sensitive you were to the COVID vaccine? Totally. Well, let's add a few more common things. Were you on the birth control pill for 10 or 15 years? That's going to make a big difference many years later at menopause. You just start adding these things up, and pretty soon you see the average American on the average number of drugs and the average, typical conditions, and the patterns start to look pretty familiar.
And the word pattern, I love the word pattern. When I was in architecture school, I remember this book called A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander. You just flip it open and it tells you, how do you make a space work? The direction of the light, the color of the pillows, the amount of space. There are these heuristics, these patterns that are timeless. And that's one reason I wanted to have you on. This going back to the repetitive and the timeless while keeping an individual point of view is where it's at in these days, where we have access to this endless information, but it's overwhelming. One thing I wanted to say too about patterns is I've always been, I had this tricky situation with my son, and I've been a research-minded person my whole life. Scott and I knew each other because we were in high school debate together. So we were always researching. And when it came to my son, I just decided I would look at patterns across every large data set I could get to. I was in Facebook groups with 10,000 parents all comparing things. I was in thousands and thousands of Amazon reviews comparing what people were saying. And then I would follow a thread of how something seemed to work for one person, but not another person, while I was also seeing an acupuncturist, a craniosacral therapist, a natural dentist, and a PTSD, like EMDR practice. Like I was going all out. And And for a while there, I was still too seeing the allopathic doctor. And so any patterns, I love that you started sharing your systemic way of look. Oh, one other thing is the complexity. I love that you talked about it's not a polarizing either or, you're a this, you're a that. Life is the billions of colors. Pure white rarely appears in nature, just as pure black. It's almost non-existent, and we have the freedom and the agency with all the rest of the ways of the colors and shades of life. And you hit a couple of the key principles about critical thinking, chronology, really looking at everything that has happened, the side effects of medications. Oh, this is one other joke. Okay, not or funny idea. I just thought, shouldn't people have to memorize all the possible side effects of a medication before they're allowed to take it? At least have read every possible side effect and know what it has and has not been tested with. I think that would be a plus to our whole collective. I guess you'd have to do the same for a lot of other treatments and supplements. But back to you, whatever you'd like to say.
Right. Well, let's make a distinction between the toxicity of pharmaceuticals and the potential toxicity of natural products. There is a big difference. Okay. Um, when it comes to the level of biochemical influence, the difference between pharmaceuticals and natural products is huge. Now, out of those two groups, pharmaceutical drugs are far more toxic and dangerous. And natural products create much fewer side effects. And if there are side effects, they tend to be mostly just irritation of the stomach, transient and mild. Okay, now the main problem with the natural products is not that they're toxic, it's that they don't work. Okay. And one of the reasons they don't work is that they're not as strong as pharmaceuticals. Okay. And so therefore, let's take something like, lowering your cholesterol. Well, you can take a statin and it will 100% guaranteed lower your LDL. But you're going to have to be on a pretty strict regimen of a lot of different natural products and a real careful diet and exercise to get your LDL down naturally. Okay. Now, the difference is that those natural things are not going to cause your cognitive function to decline, and they're not going to cause your musculoskeletal system to become massively inflamed. Okay. But therefore, we have to ask the question, when do we need drugs? Now, here's a principle. And this is based on the fact that I see a lot of people on medications. And so I make a distinction between the original pathology and the problems caused by the drugs. And so when somebody comes to me and we put together their health history and they say, I have decades of having anxiety and depression. And then we look at the medications and they started those 10 years ago. Okay. Then I ask them, have you researched the side effects of, Zoloft and Prozac and things like that? And they haven't. And I say, have you ever tried to stop? And they say, yes. And I say, well, what happened? They say, I couldn't sleep. Okay, then what I point out is that you've got two problems. One is you've got the underlying anxiety and depression, and now you have a neurochemical dependency on benzodiazepines or serotonin reuptake inhibitors. All right, now, those are two distinct problems because once people are on the medications, those are hard to stop. And that has to be addressed completely differently than just the underlying anxiety. Okay, and so that's one principle, and that illustrates how potent the pharmaceutical drugs are. And in a case like that, withdrawing from benzodiazepines or SSRIs, the herbs are virtually worthless. You can't drink chamomile tea to overcome, 3 weeks of absolutely no sleep when you try to stop Prozac. It doesn't work. Okay. Now, another big issue that is there um, is herb-drug interaction. Now, we have to know certain categories of drugs. That's the starting point. Most of the herbs by themselves are safe, but there are a few herbs that don't mix well with a few categories of medications. And we have to know those. Now, before we start saying, well, the naturopathic community or the herbalists are giving all of these wrong things, okay, they're mixing herbs and drugs. Let's look at where the problem really is, and that is that doctors are prescribing drugs that shouldn't be given together. In other words, drug toxicity is a much more serious problem than herb drug toxicity. There are a few cases that everybody probably has heard about. You don't take St. John's wort with SSRIs. You don't take ginkgo when you're on blood thinners, things like that. Those are pretty common, easy to find adverse reactions, but they're not even that serious most of the time. Okay. What's serious is when a doctor gives a prescription to a patient and the patient goes to the pharmacist and the pharmacist says, I won't fill this because the doctor is making a potentially fatal mistake prescribing you these two drugs. So the pharmacists identify these mistakes that doctors make. And in some cases, I have identified a few of those drug-drug interactions and said, you better take that prescription back to the doctor and talk to them about it right away. And you can find that information. Again, drugs.com. Just go there, do the drug interactions. Now, that's far more serious than herb drug interactions. Okay, but these are all issues that we have to know about if we're doing clinical level self-care. But by far, the most complicated issue is the pharmaceuticals. It's not that the herbs are causing problems, it's the pharmaceuticals that are so toxic. And the principle that I go for, since I have many people that come to me and they're on multiple medications, I say, all right, we've got the original condition and now we've got a secondary condition, which is multiple medications. I say, what's our goal? I never interfere with people's prescriptions. I say, you need to articulate a clear goal to your doctor. And that clear goal is you want to be on the least number of medications. Because many times when people are on 5 or 6 medications, they don't need all of them. Okay, they could be on 2 or 3. And then you need to be on the lowest possible dose of the least number of medications. And so if you've got a person who's getting really sick because the spiral of side effects is putting them on more and more drugs, you want to back that out and you want to say, all right, let's see if we can get you off of this and get you off of that and reduce this and reduce that. That's the argument that you have to talk to the doctor about. And so one of the things that I do is I'm an advocate for being your own attorney. Okay, you have to go in, you have to make a case, and you have to print out those pages and pages of side effects, and you have to circle them and say, this started after I started this, and I got this when I started that. And you have to make a case, and you have to say, I want to be on less medications. Now, most doctors are willing to talk about it.
David, this is huge. This is huge. I just looked up, on average, about 6 prescription drugs per person per year are filled in the United States.
That's
Children,
right.
2, adults, 4, adults 45 to 64, 9, adults 65 and over, 20 plus prescriptions per
That's
year.
it. That's the condition of medicine now. And that's why I say we got to know self-care. And since you have just given us that really shocking statistic, let me share a story from a friend of mine who's a hospice worker. He told me that when patients are brought to hospice, that all their medications are discontinued. And now there's a new phenomena that's happening that when people are taken off their medications in hospice, they come back to life and they're sent home. Okay. So the amount of drug consumption is shocking, and what it's doing to people is shocking. And at the same time, we can't just say, you know, all drugs are bad. I mean, we can't just say, you can't do this. We've got to be very
Careful. Yeah,
careful
and
because these drugs in some cases are genuinely giving people higher quantity and quality of life. It's just that the average person doesn't know when to stop.
yeah, and it says here that among adults over 65, around 40% take more than five different medications
I
daily.
know it's unbelievable.
And guys, I've had a couple of times I had to take antibiotics, but I've never been on a steady prescription drug. When my son was a few weeks old, he was prescribed acid reflux medicine. He started to get worse and worse, and then and there was a surgery that didn't solve the problem, and it was a $350,000 mess that thankfully I
Wow.
only had to pay $20,000 because I had great insurance. I'm telling you guys. And then I started to learn how the body works. I learned what the breastfeeding mother needs to eat. I learned what was setting him off. It got me here today because other people aren't as nutty. They're not as nutty as me and you, David.
Or proactive or as interested or have as much critical thinking and do the research. It takes a lot of time. Now, one further thought here.
One thing on that was the second. I mean, we tried it for like a month or two, and things were just getting worse and worse. And I asked the doctor, "Okay, how long will we be on this?" "Oh, maybe the rest of his life." I was like, "No way!" I was like, "Absolutely not." So I love when this is kind of echoing back to what is someone's goal? Do they want to reduce the number of medications? Do they want to, yeah. So, but go on, go on.
No, I was just going to add one more thought to that, and that is that, this vast overconsumption of medications is all new, and pharmaceutical medicine and all the choices are all new. You see, we didn't have these options even 50 years ago. We certainly didn't have these options 100 years ago. And so now we are facing a kind of medical, existential, philosophical question. And this is something that I talk to people about a lot who are elderly patients on multiple medications. Okay, it's an existential spiritual issue because at what point do you want to let go? That's the question. Okay. How long do you want to use pharmaceutical medicine to keep yourself alive and at what cost? And so therefore, we can see all these different examples. And a really common example is everybody is being prescribed statins now. That's the latest rage handed out to everyone. It's going to prevent your heart attack and stroke. But what they're not telling you is that this is contributing to the epidemic of cognitive decline and dementia. Okay. And so here's the trade-off. And this is just one drug, but there's a trade-off with every drug. Here's the trade-off. You can keep your LDL down and reduce your risk of heart attack and stroke, maybe. And at the same time, do you want to trade off a healthier brain in the long run? Okay, now that's the question that we find with a lot of these medications is that they may extend the quantity of life, but there's a huge price for it in terms of quality of life. And that's where this whole issue, of elderly people going into hospice and they're basically dying and they come off the drugs, they come back to life. And so the question is, we now have all of these choices. We now have all of these pharmaceutical ways to prolong our life, but at what cost? And at what point do we make the decision that I'm just going to let nature run its course? And that's an individual decision, and many people don't want to make that decision, and that's why they will keep taking more and more drugs until the very end. But for other people, I also see many cases where people say these drugs are making me so sick, I'm not going to do it anymore, even though I know I'm going to die from not doing it. Now, that happens also with chemotherapy and cancer. It happens with statins and heart attack cases. Many cases where the treatment is worse than the disease, and people just say, I would rather just live the rest of my life without the medications than feel so sick from the medications.
Yeah, quality of life, adding life to our years, even more important than years to our life.
Right.
I just looked up another stat because I read this one book many years ago called Death by Medicine, showing how the statistics can be pushed to get a study to say a certain thing. And an example they used, I believe, was statins. So I just looked it up. So someone who doesn't have heart disease, statins could add lifespan 3 to 6 months. And that doesn't even account for, like you said, what are all the side effects? What other drugs are being taken along with this statin? And what if even the benchmarks that are being set for healthy cholesterol, what if the target we're aiming at isn't ancestral at all, or it's not suitable for this person's. And so I love everything you're saying. Guys, we can't just trust that a busy but well-meaning medical professional is going to be able to really take all these things into consideration that you can. And that's how David helps. Guys, it sounds like if I were looking at something serious, I'd be at David's website right now scheduling a consultation.
Oh, thank you for that.
Because we got to wrap this up. David. So
Yes,
on,
yes.
on David's website, it's called Crow Consultations, right? Is that it?
Crowconsultations.com, CROW, and then consultationsplural.com. And then over on the consultation page, that is where you can see the description of clinical level self-care and where you can schedule. And I also offer free events, many times meditation events, and I also teach many courses. There's courses on safe and natural detoxification and healthy digestion. And I also weave all of this together with the spiritual lineages of classical Asian medicine. So Chinese medicine is inseparable from Taoism, and Ayurveda is inseparable from the Vedas and Tantra and so forth. And so I have studied both of these systems and weave them back together again. And I teach about how to do that, how to use meditation practice to potentize the herbs and how to use herbs to strengthen your meditation practice. And so basically, there's the clinical level self-care, and then there's the reintegration of natural medicine back into the original spiritual roots of how they were used.
I couldn't think of a more holistic way of looking at things. I like that you took several ancient traditions and their full ecosystem that includes the spiritual, along with making this bridge to thoughtfully using getting the best out of modern tools. Guys, David is also an author. On his website, you'll see he wrote this book called In Search of the Medicine Buddha. What a pleasure, David! Wow. Any last words before we say goodbye?
Thank you. Those are my last words. Thank you, Deb, for all the great work that you are doing. Great conversation, great questions, great insights, and a real pleasure and honor to be able to talk to your audience. Thank you.
All right. We're building better health here, guys. It takes a village. All right. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Bye.